Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on Zoom and for this panel called Ecstatic Intersections, the X in Queer and Trans Latinx Reparations, Formations, and Resistances. And my name is David Tenorio. I'll talk a little bit more about me in a minute, but I am thrilled and so excited to be in conversation with three queer and trans Latinx icons and superheroes of mine. So let's just give a round of applause, virtual applause, to my collaborators and the wonderful queer and trans people that we're going to be conversing with today. So thank you so much for accepting this invitation. I'll start by introducing each one of you, and then we'll move to I'll just simply describe the dynamic of the conversation, and then we'll tackle the questions that we're prepared for this panel. So we are joined by the wonderful Carlos García León, they, who is an anti-capitalist, community-centric theoretical fundraiser. They currently work as the individual giving manager at Chicago Shakespeare Theater, where they lead all individual giving and planned giving efforts. So money. They are queer, non-binary Latina, Mexican, Statian, who was born in Atlisco, Puebla, Mexico, and currently reside in Chicago, Illinois. Their work, both in the arts and social justice, through their work, both in the arts and through writing, is driven by a fight for cultural equity, decolonizing the arts, and social justice. Carlos holds an BM in bassoon performance from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and an MA in arts administration, and an MBA from the University of Cincinnati. Outside of working and writing, Carlos is also a poet, a writer, fledgling kickboxer. Damn. We have some martial art, well, not martial arts, but we'll all benefit from a little bit more, maybe some conversations on kickboxing and self-defense. They enjoy their leisure time by hanging with friends, resisting capitalism, by taking naps and exploring new Chicago food spots. So thank you so much, Carlos, for being here today. We have also the wonderful Raquel Salas Rivera, they, who is a Puerto Rican poet and translator of trans experience, born in Mayagüez, Puerto Rico. His honors include being named the Poet Laureate of Philadelphia, the Premio Nuevas Voces, a Lamba Literary Award, and the inaugural Ambrosio Prize. He is the author of 6 poetry books and the editor of the anthologies Puerto Rico en mi corazón, published in 2019, and La piel del arrecife, Antología de Poesía Trans Puertorriqueña, published in 2023. His translations include The Rust of History from 2022, a selection of poetry by his grandfather, Sotero Rivera Aviles, longlisted for Alta's National Translation Award, and the Book of Conjurations by Iriselma Robles, winner of the Sundial Literary Translation Award. His translation of Ada Limon's poem dedicated to NASA's Europe Clipper mission will be traveling to Jupiter's moon in 2024. I assume it'll be sometime shortly.
In the fall. I think it's October.
Oh.
Not so shortly.
Nice. Well, it's coming. get ready, Jupiter Moon. And Roque lives, teaches, and creates in Puerto Rico, accompanied by his cat, Pietri. He's currently working on a trans epic poem, Algarabía, which will be published in 2025 by Grey Wolf Press. And finally, the ever so radiant Julio Salgado, who is the co-founder of Dreamers Adrift and the Migrant Storytelling Manager for the Center for Cultural Power. His status as an undocumented queer artivist has fueled the contents of his visual art, which depict key individual moments of the key individuals and moments of the Dream Act and the migrant rights movement. Undocumented students, organizers, and allies across the country have used Salgado's artwork to call attention to the migrant rights movement. Salgado is also co-creator of the Disruptors Fellowship, a program at the Center for Cultural Power for emerging television writers of color who identify as trans and or non-binary, disabled, undocumented, formerly undocumented, and also formerly undocumented immigrants. His work has been displayed at the Oakland Museum of Art, SF MoMA, and the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to be also, and lastly, the sparkly, bubbly David Tenorio, if I just say so myself, who's going to be moderating this panel and also contributing to the conversation as a panelist. I'm currently an assistant professor in the Department of Hispanic Languages and Literatures, which name like that, I don't really like that name, so we're going to be changing it to Spanish and Portuguese shortly. And I'm a faculty affiliate to the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program, the graduate program in Cultural Studies, and the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. My work centers on, sits at the intersection of Latinx and Latin American cultural studies. And my interdisciplinary work mostly examines queer and trans nightlife performance as an extension of political activism. So without further ado, I ask the audience to please extend the warmest of welcome to our panelists today. Thank you so much again for being here. And how we're going to do this is the panelists, we have 3 questions and that we ask our panelists to prepare. Well, not 3 questions that you were asked to prepare, sorry. We have 3 questions that will be the center of our conversation today. And let's just start with the first one. And the first question goes, could you start by sharing with everyone here, how is it that you came aware of your own queerness or transness, your own brownness, your own difference, your own Blackness, if that applies to you? Maybe an experience with your family, with your friends at school or at any institution. And how does your work grapple with those forming experiences and their resonance across the ways in which you engage with the world through your art in the here and now? So are you okay if we start with Carlos, followed by Roque, and then Julio, and then I'll just pepper things up?
I love a little peppering everywhere here and there.
Perfect.
Yeah, I can happy to begin this wonderful topic. As I was thinking about this question, I had to, go back to early versions of Carlos. And what I've decided to share is that I think I had to first grapple, or at least I like to say that I've grappled with my queerness first before I really understood my own Mexican identity, my brownness. And I say that because not that I didn't know I was Mexican, I was born in Mexico, I grew up there for a little bit, but then living in the States, like what Mexico, what being a Mexican kid felt so different, particularly now as I was enveloping myself in queerness. And I like didn't see myself as like I couldn't see a queer Mexican identity that felt right, because a lot of a lot of the stories and depictions of queer Mexican folks or just queer Latinas was not me. There was no it always felt very like ridicule or cartoonish. And I hadn't seen many examples. So I often like to say that like coming in terms with my queerness really opened up my eyes of what identity can be. And then that really opened up my eyes and like, oh, my Mexican identity can be whatever I want it to be because I will forever be Mexican and I will forever be queer. And that really helped along those lines of battling like the anti-heteronormativity that I now really do a lot of my work in. And in my field, it's really easy to put that queer lens on, seen as like, oh, I'm battling norms, and not necessarily like heteronormative norms, but it's so much easier to be like, I don't want to do fundraising this way simply because it's always been the way fundraisers have done it. Now I can do it whatever way feels right for me, feels ethical. It feels that I'm involving more people, whether they are queer or more Black and brown folks in my work. And I feel just comfortable being like, I'm happy to go my own path if it just feels right to me because of all of that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carlos. There's so many things that I would like to poke further at, but I'll just let Roque continue with the conversation.
Thank you for that, Carlos. Can everyone hear me? Just want to make sure we're good. Yeah, I also thought a lot about the question. I think especially this week, the Cumbre Afro is happening in Puerto Rico. So there's a lot of conversation around race specifically. And, I think my journey maybe looks a little different. I guess everyone's does, right? But um, I grew up until the age of 14 in the US, but both my parents had been political activists in Puerto Rico and had not previously lived in the US. So my connection with being Puerto Riqueño was very rooted in fear, fear of political repression. They had lived in a period of very intense political repression. And when I was relatively young, I was like maybe 6 or 7, we moved to Nebraska. So I had very early racialized experience in which I was called spick or in which my mother was called worse things because she's darker than me. So I think I had that's one of my first kind of awarenesses of myself as racialized. But then I also had a very strong awakening when I moved to Alabama to realize the ways in which I certainly was not racialized like people who were close to me who were Black were, right? That was very drastic, the difference, and the ways in which I could, in some contexts, in many contexts, was read as white. So I guess that's my saying that, it's an ongoing kind of like examination of my proximity to whiteness that has kind of definitely came back for me when I moved, or took a different form when I moved to Puerto Rico at the age of 14, in which I'm very much a white person here. So that felt like it bore a very complex relationship to my queerness. I had multiple layers of coming out. Initially coming out as what I understood as bi, and then being like I'm gay, and then being like, wait a minute, something's happening with my gender, and then coming out as I'd say layers of coming out as trans, right? And also kind of still happening, right? Starting testosterone was in and of itself a transition, changing my name. So it's hard to think of queerness as a static thing for me because I don't think it has ever been fully stabilized in that way. And yeah, I'd say my journey is one that's ongoing. It's one I hope to continue examining, and I'm always willing to talk about, and that I've spent maybe the last few years even more fully dedicated to thinking of how I can support trans artists in Puerto Rico, especially trans writers that have so few spaces. There are maybe like less than 5 trans poets that have published books here. And of those, and there are certainly many, many trans poets, you know. So it becomes a matter of access, it becomes a matter of money, of brokenness, you know. And that's kind of where I am. Thank you for the question.
Thank
I
you
have
so much. Go for it. Go for it.
All right. Thank you so much for having us, and thank you, Carlos and Roque, for sharing. I am a visual artist, so I brought photos and drawings to answer this question. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. How do I start? Okay, here we go. Nope. That's not how you do it. Slideshow. There we go. So to answer this question, I always, I became aware of my queerness at a very young age. I mean, when I saw Aladdin, when I was like 9 years old, like I knew. But more than anything within my family, the picture that it's in the screen right now is of a young me when I was 11 or 12 years old. 12 years old. This was January of 1996. Yeah, I was 12 years old, and I was next to my tío Chicho. My tío Chicho was someone that, he came out in the late 80s, like, I'm gay, I'm here. And so he really sort of created a floor plan for me to have the conversation of just me coming out. Of course, the journey there wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, right? Like, I always saw my tío as someone the person who I wanted to be and the person who I didn't want it to be, right? Within my own homophobia. Hearing my cousins talk about my tío, this was also the height of, the AIDS pandemic, and how it affected, who specifically a gay brown man was, right? And so my uncle unfortunately passed away in 2018. And so when he passed, because I'm undocumented, and he was also undocumented here in the US, he actually self-deported in the mid-2000s. And in the back of my mind, I was like, whenever I get papers, I'm going to go back to Mexico and I'm going to interview him and we're going to have a project. Unfortunately, he left too soon. And when he passed, one of my aunts gave me this box that I have right here, full of photographs. And I was like, I wanted to honor my uncle. And so he started coming to me in dreams, right? And I was like, why didn't we ever have that conversation? What it meant to be queer, what it meant to be, even what it meant to be undocumented, right? And so, but as I look through these photos that my aunt sent me, my uncle really left me that sort of like, be yourself. There's this idea of immigrant families, specifically the homophobia. It's real, it exists, right? But my uncle allowed me to see that if your family is giving you a window of like being open to you, like you get through that window and you like be your full self, right? And so my uncle would always have like dinner parties with his friends in the various apartments that he lived all around LA, and he was just himself, right? And so one of the things that I'm currently working on as I'm, looking through these photos, I started making a lot of art based on those photos. But I also started looking back on my own youth and how when I was, this is like me in 2001. And that year I so wanted to come out to my uncle. I so wanted to tell my uncle like, tío, soy como tú, like I'm gay too, but I just didn't have the words. And again, I didn't get to tell him. But so right now I'm working on this story of specifically the year 2001. How it was very pivotal for me because I went from being 17 to being 18 to becoming I went from being an undocumented youth to an adult undocumented immigrant. And I wanted to pay homage to my uncle through the art that I do, through the writing, through this I'm trying to put together a graphic memoir. And I just finished reading this book called How We Named the Stars by Andres Ordorica, which I recommend. And it was the first time that I saw a story about a gay Mexican immigrant talking about a gay Mexican uncle. And I was like, I had to reach out to him and I was like, oh my God, I'm so happy that we're telling the stories of the people that came before us, because I just think that we need to, pay homage to them, because we're here because of them. So that's my spiel. That's how I hope I answered the question.
Of course you all did. Thank you so much for sharing such personal stories. That I think that in a way they all connect us in our like brownness and queerness, and also kind of like, echoing what Cherry Moraga or Gloria Saldúa would say of this kind of just hemispheric joteria, right? Like this family or this skin that we come to build through our own experiences of marginalization, of oppression, of discrimination, and just hearing your stories. I kind of just feel inspired by talking about my own personal stories. I was born and raised in Mexico City. I was born to a family of local merchants in downtown Mexico City. And of course, I am one of the very few, well, not very few people in my family, but a large part of my family is white passing and very fair skin. And growing up in Mexican society, which is an extremely heterosexual, very racist, very nationalistic culture, we grew up with that white proximity and the privileges of navigating predominantly white passing society with ease. And it wasn't not until I migrated to the North that I came to realize just the complexities of race, not just in Mexico, but also in the United States, how all is kind of just gets all very murky when you consider immigration status, citizenship, and all that. Later on, I'm going to touch on my own kind of like performance as a drag queen, Piña Colada, and how that came about. But I remember, like, from a very young age that I didn't feel. I was in kindergarten, and I was playing with. I remember the like, it was like a makeshift kindergarten school that was the house of the principal. So it was basically a very a community base of sort, a community base childcare or homeschool. And when we were going on breaks, I remember I would see the boys going to one side of the yard, the patio, and the boys would just go with the boys, the girls would go with the girls, and I just wanted to be where I was, and I was the Little Mermaid. In my head, I was playing the Little Mermaid scenes of the movie, and I was just being by myself, and I didn't really understand why I didn't fit into any of those categories. And that is something that kind of just stayed with me from a very young age. I remember putting on makeup, doing my nails with my mom's nail polish and using my mom's dresses and makeup. And I would get spanked by that. I would be punished by engaging with those acts of like femininity and be chastised for letting go of a certain, of my privilege as a man, or like not accepting masculinity. And I think that has been kind of very foundational to how I now understand, my place in the world, and also just the enormous opportunity that I've had to navigate the thorny structures and infrastructures of academia, a place that is extremely racist, extremely homophobic, transphobic, misogynistic. So every time I feel like a little down, I just, I remember I'm still a little mermaid, and just, whipping my hair up and down. So with that, let's move on to the second question. And this second question gestures to the title of this panel. So, which, leads us to thinking or feeling about a queer sense of bliss, a queer ecstasies or ecstasy, however we want to phrase that. That is, we are reminded of those moments where, or when our queerness, our racialized sense of queerness and transness and gender nonconformance, it's not only a site and a space of oppression, but also it allows us to do something, and it allows our experiences of oppression to be transformed into forces of renewal, of reparation, and resistance through that queer bliss, right? So how does your work combine your own experiences of queer pleasure to embody some sort of political resistance to what we live, especially in this cruel time? Carlos, you can take it from the top.
Yes, we'll go in the same order. As I was thinking on this, first, I love the notion of queer bliss. It feels incredible. I thought of two things that came to mind. One is I think I take a lot of pleasure from resisting like everything just through naps. And I derived that a lot from the nap ministry, which was started by a Black woman who truly believes though it's an act of resistance against capitalism. And I think oftentimes of the pressure of Black and brown bodies to work constantly to at least get to the same kind of I don't want to call it advantages, but like the same place as white folks. But also I think of like my time as an immigrant, my parents, and often the storyline is just like, oh, like as immigrants or as kids of immigrants, we have to work harder because we have to honor the sacrifices of our ancestors, and there's no time to rest. And nowadays I think of it as like, oh, I'm fully living my ancestors' wildest dreams when I take a nap, because I can't imagine my great grandparents even dreaming of napping. And had they even had time to think about what life would be if they weren't constantly working, I think they would envision wanting to rest. So I take a nap in my office, not every day, but sometimes when I need it, which I try to do every day, and close the door. I'm just like, I'm gonna take a nap. One, because if I want my work to be excellent, I need to be rested. But two, because I I mean, one, I don't want to really work, but two, I wanna rest for not just me, but for all the family members that have come before me. Um, and because I think they deserve that. And the other thing that was coming to mind when I'm thinking of queer bliss is, people who know me know I love a chunky boot. I love a chunky heel. I can run and duck walk in those things. And one time I was working for the Orchestra of the Americas tour in Mexico. And I feel powerful. I feel gorgeous. I feel beautiful in a chunky boot. And I had completely forgotten that when I was in Mexico, across like the country, and I was just like walking in the audience's box office with a chunky boot, and like I forgot I'm so used to like the stares that people give when they see like a human with a male presenting body with a chunky boot. And I was just like, oh right, like thing people see, especially folks who are coming to like arts and culture, where the stigma of like being a classist and elitist, like really fitting to the gender molds of what those things can be. So I was just like, yeah, like, can I swear in this? Can like, I was like, I was like, F you all folks in the class. Like, let me gender bend a little bit with you all. And then I saw like kids of those adults, and I was reminded of like the potential optimism that may occur when a kid who may be feeling the same way a lot of us feel when we're questioning our gender or our sexuality gets to see someone like us as adults happy and living and excited about the work we're doing. And I thought, oh, like not I'm not doing this just for me, apparently. I'm doing this for young folks who maybe have never seen good representation of what their future might be. And I absolutely adore that. So here, I try to wear a chunky boot or wear a lovely dress every time we have an opening night at Chicago Shakespeare. Just because one, I do want to make white people uncomfortable, but two, because in case anyone sees me who's coming to see our shows, gets to see someone who is a Latina, gender non-conforming folk, gets to see something that's as beautiful as that.
Qué lindo eso. I'm getting bliss from Julio's background office space. That's giving me bliss and all those beautiful images. And I did have a question for you. Maybe you can answer later at some point, is like if you felt that your uncle knew either way, whether or not you told him, you know. Um, yeah, bliss. I like laughter a lot. Um, I definitely feel like if I didn't have laughter in my life, I would not be here. Uh, and I think it's important, even especially like working through trauma, to be able to like have a space for that because it's so constant and such a like, to be able to laugh at like having blackouts 3 times a week, is I think healthy, even if I'm cussing out, Luma as I'm doing it, right? But I definitely think poetry for me has always been that space consistently. I'm writing a trans epic and it's the hardest and most joyful and most blissful thing. And I think of it the way I think of when I take my tea shot. It's like a little tiny vial full of bliss. And I'm injecting it in my body and I don't know exactly what it's gonna do, but it's like a fissure and time and space and possibility that maybe my trans ancestors did not have access to, definitely did not have access to before a certain era, right? So survival, being able to like feel like I'm here and I'm 38, which is 2 years more than the age I'm supposed to be. That is weirdly a source of bliss. I know it sounds strange, but there's something there of maybe it's like a fuck you too, it's like a resistance and insistence on being here that, yeah, I'd say about that. Smoking weed brings me bliss. Um,
Thank you, Carlos and Roque. Roque, actually, yesterday I was, as part of this project that I'm doing for the memoir, been doing some interviews with my family, and I interviewed a friend of my uncle, and this was like his childhood friend. They, used to party back in Ensenada at this like sort of clandestine, like bars, like clandestinos, like, where it wasn't really a bar, but all the kids went there. And that was one of the questions that I asked them. I was like, did my uncle know that I was gay? And literally he's like, girl, he knew. Like he specifically told me of this story when my mom used to make pozole and ceviche, and my tío loved pozole and ceviche, and he would tell his friend Agustin, that's his name, And he's like, oh, my sister made some pozole and ceviche, let's go eat. And she's like, and by the way, look at Julio, he's one of us. Like he used to tell us to his friend Agustin. And Agustin was like, yeah, like, he's just sometimes he's just not new, but because it was a different time, right? Like, I mean, we still have that narrative now that drag queens are trying to induct kids into the gay agenda or whatever. So I could only imagine how my uncle felt that it wasn't his place to talk to me about this, right? And so in the same time, and in the story that I'm trying to kind of make sense of, also why I didn't have the guts to ask him even when I was this close, but my uncle was he was this very like serious person, because he was trying to protect himself. He was trying so hard to live this like masculine life, even though like, I see pictures where he was just living his life, which takes me to this answer of, this question of those moments of bliss, right? Like I definitely, uh, looking back, I don't party as often. I'm 40 now and I've been sober for 3 years. And I think those while I'm sober, I'm still very like, let do whatever you need to do, right? And really, it's taken me, I have to do addiction-based therapy to kind of deal with some of the monsters that I was dealing with. But one of those things was that, this conversations around, to Carlos' point of like the narrative of the immigrant being like, you need to work hard, you need to be respectful, you need to have America accept you and embrace you because immigrants are whatever. And I don't want to do that. And so one of the things that I'm trying to put in my work, it's a lot of like, listen, coming together to bars, having fun, moments where when it's enough, or when do you need those moments to kind of like numb the pain, right? Like those are real conversations, both the good and the bad, right? Like I think it's important, but like we're at a point where like no, like you need to be careful not to talk about those things or put them in your work, because when you try to get your papers, you're gonna leave a document of the illegal things. I'm like, girl, this country already sees me as illegal. So like, what's a little fun? But using those moments to put into my work, I feel that um it's a documentation that we are not just victims. Yeah, this system is racist and all the things, but there's moments of joy that I don't just wanna create art that brings the sadness. There's a reason. I'm intentional around creating images that are bright and colorful. Because I love Daria and The Simpsons, and you can see the influence. But I just want to be intentional around creating colorful art that brings us joy.
Thank you so much for sharing those lovely stories. And, being surrounded by all of you just makes my heart spark with joy and queer bliss. And that is some of the things that why it's so important for us, queer and trans folk to come out and hang out and kiki and find in the everyday annoyances spaces where we can just feel, where we can just rest. And hearing you speak is just so inspiring, because it really resonates with a lot of, it's like when you bringing together magnets and they're just like attracting each other. So I'm going to share briefly a slide. I don't know if you can see it. Can you see it? Okay, perfect. Let me see if this thing doesn't act up on me. But one of the reasons why I'm a fan of Julio's work is precisely because it speaks so much about the experiences not just of myself, but the people that I love, the queer people that I love. And that, you know, in this whole debate about Latinx and what does the X mean and whatnot, I do find the X a powerful wild card, very similar to the asterisk in trans. And thinking about that has also inspired kind of like my own work and, autoethnography in drag performance. So thinking about the X, I was just, the queer glamorous intellectual came out, and I was just like, well, let's just, abstract it a little bit. And I was thinking about, how does the X allow us to mobilize into action and seek alternatives for sensual connection while we kind of try to dodge the systems of death and value that we constantly interact in particular in this space. And, you don't have to answer the question, but I was thinking about, why is it that glitter and going thrift store shopping with queer people, and for I go I go shopping to the thrift store when I'm looking for cheap drag clothing and accessories. And going through my kind of like my upbringing, I remember that I first came into contact with glitter at this kind of like rural beauty pageant competition. Well, the pageant in Actopan, Hidalgo, where my mom is from, and one of my aunts competed, and she was crowned queen. And I remember holding the crown, and all that, the intersection in a way of like, the crown kind of like mimics that instability of X, and all the glitter and the rhinestones, and me holding the little thing. So, and looking at my aunt Wendy doing this performance of hyperfemininity in like rural Mexico, kind of inspired Piña Colada, who is just this queen that loves the recycledness of clothes, and likes to go shopping at thrift stores to refuse that excessive consumption of like gay normative or homonormative capitalist culture, and do something else with it. So I find joy in those, like, in the used objects of glitter that make me come alive at a bar, and that allow me to do a lip sync of like Daniela Romo or Rocío Dúrcal, and be able to connect that kind of like queer sonic memory with the people around me. So I'll stop there. And I'll move on to the third and last question, but that, just because it's our last question doesn't mean that we have to stop talking. So the third question goes, if we understand that the political is personal, this feminist motto that has been even like commercialized, and that for us, the personal can and might refer to every day and the every night gestures of cruising, of dancing, of what you said, of resting, of creative writing, of touching, of sexting, of gossiping, of singing, or you name it. How does your work propose, even if it's little by little, through small acts, how does it challenge the current structures of power that also impact how we build our own sense of intimacy?
I love this question. I love this question so much. Um, yeah, things that as I was thinking about. One, let me just say it is so good to hear that we're acknowledging that like there is a difference between like gayness and queerness. And I oftentimes with like gay friends who also identify as queer, but like I don't think understand the ideology, the difference ideology, and the like. For me, at least, like queerness feels very anti-heteronormative, and it's not necessarily, like I'm just repeating words from other folks, but like it doesn't have to do anything with who I sleep with, but it is about battling heteronormative ideology. And gayness is just like, cool, I sleep with men as a man, and then I'll like abide by heteronormative norms. Which is why like I love queer spaces, but I don't necessarily like gay clubs. But so I just wanted to like those were things that are happening in my mind. But in terms of this question, the only reason I'm still in fundraising, one is because I'm hoping to eventually destroy the field from the inside out as an anti-capitalist fundraiser. But two, I really feel comfortable now as someone in proximity to wealth, which means I'm in proximity of power. And I think of the possibilities of what art can do in whether it was in theater or in opera formerly where I worked or an orchestra, which is my background, and what that might mean to the folks who are attending, but also to the folks who may have never attended or were and have this idea that like they're not welcome in these spaces because I've sadly only mostly have worked in predominantly white institutions. So I think of like, oh, I can have this conversation with like Mr. David Smith, hypothetical person who like gives us a lot of money, and he's like, this is why we need like a queer show, or this is why we need this like Latine theater to come and play. And I'm currently thinking of I'm currently in Glendale, Los Angeles, and I went to Pasadena Playhouse yesterday, and they have this great show called One of the Good Ones, which is oh, can you see it? There we go. Anyway, it's called One of the Good Ones by Gloria Calderon Kellett, and the whole show is about this Latina family who their daughter, like this perfect daughter, is bringing a boyfriend for the first time, and he's like a very white passing Mexican. So they talk about identity. They have this conversation of like Latino, Latinx, Latine, and I have never seen that on a stage. And nowadays I'm just like, that's something I can do. Like I can tell these other white people who've been giving this money to this organization that this is important work to be shared on stage. And seeing a theater full of Latinos, seeing a theater that is predominantly white and historically so, full of Latinos laughing and enjoying themselves and hearing the talk back afterwards that they were really engaging with the work, I just thought that's important. And I don't think non-Latinos in the arts administration field could have made that happen had not been someone pushing that forward or making maybe folks who are questioning why that's on stage to begin with, and a movement to understanding of why it's important. And so yeah, I feel really blessed and honored to be a part of that progress as a fundraiser, as an arts administrator.
Such a great question, also because it has so many entry points. For me at least, it's hard because I definitely have different aspects of what I consider my work. I could approach it thinking about my poetry, and how I do that in my poetry, my translation practice, which I think of as very political, in specifically how I try to engage with it, or sort of my cultural curation work or sort of like publication work in terms of like organizing spaces in Puerto Rico and when I was in the US. And there's such very different ways of answering them. And I guess that's kind of answers the question, right? That I think it's so case specific. I think even of a word like Latinx, which makes complete sense for me for the panel and in spaces in the US and here. Like, I think the only time I've seen Latino or Latina even outside of like melon-funded panels, you know, is like is like en un chinchorro, you know, like someone came back from la diaspora and they, you know, and it's a stand-in for almost like diaspora, you know, in a sense, because the conversations are very different and around identity, you know. Um and that, you know, and that's something that I would like to bridge more, and I continued trying to bridge. For example, poets in the US who are de la diaspora, they don't really know much about like publication circulation or even poetry that's happening in Puerto Rico, with some exceptions, and vice versa. So there's like, you know, in Puerto Rico, there's, you know, they stopped the Pedro Pietri and the New Euricans, you know, it's very little, you know, maybe someone who becomes very known as a spoken word artist might circulate with like younger writers, but there's not a continuous conversation between the two. So I would say that that's one of my focal points. And it's sounds abstract, but in the day to day, it's like it is a kind of daily navigation of like translating, in effect, you know, practices, ways of moving through spaces, ways of organizing, explaining that you physically have to take your books to every bookstore because there's no internal circulation in Puerto Rico. There's no like mechanism to circulate these books that isn't literally, you know, presses and booksellers taking their books bookstore to bookstore, you know, en una maleta. So I think stuff like that is stuff that I think of as every day because I do it every day. But beyond that, right, beyond that, I like to think of my poetry as a space where I'm much freer than I am in other spaces. By that I mean, you know, fine. When I'm translating between two people, there are some ethical constraints. But when I'm writing poetry at the end of the day, it kind of is my space, you know, to create something. Whether it be me extending an arm, you know, or opening something up or thinking of myself in relation to others, it's still in a sense a space where I have a lot more play. And I think in that sense, I am very defensive of the small things that make poetry, you know, like um uh for the longest I didn't use capitalization in any of my books as part of a longer tradition of Puerto Rican poetries and poets in the 70s, like Angela Maria Davila, who would write like that. And you know, if anyone would change that in my writing, I would get like, what are you doing? You know, so I think that there's something for me in defending that space as like a special sort of spell, almost like a spell. You wouldn't change a part of a spell because it would change what the spell does, you know? Um, and I think that I still feel that way in my core. You know, there's something important about thinking of the things we create as, even if they are within capitalism and they get marketed, right, and they get sold, as something we deserve. It deserves to be defended as like not always legible or incommensurable, or like just something that resists sort of being moved around easily, is another thing commodified by neoliberalism. And I think that art, you know, some of the best art does that for me. You know, I can look at it and I connect with it, even if it's not mine, but I connect with it not because it's aspiring to a universality, but because it's, you know, speaking from a very situated and located in a real place, including like that crown, which was amazing. You know, it's a beautiful crown, like hermoso, tú sabes. And I think that I would say that's my practice.
Yeah, David, kudos, because I tried drag twice. I did it right one time because somebody else did my makeup, and I was like, while I love trying all kinds of mediums, drag is not for me because I don't have the patience even to be painted. And so, you know, I think people that do that medium, just performing itself, it's a whole different thing. That my drag name, oh sorry, I'm like looking, it's Perla del Norte. Perla. Or if there's that one, of course we have a bunch of them. There's Janita Rivera also. So there's those two. But yeah, it's just so this question is very you know, I'm very lucky that through my work I've gotten to a point where people are interested in, you know, uh, me writing pieces about myself. So I'm in my little Sex in the City moment, or I call it Trauma in the City moment, because I started doing a monthly comic strip for the LA Times. And through Elle, which is the Latinx initiative that they started, and they slashed recently because of budget cuts, but we won't get into it. It's a whole thing. But luckily, they're still allowing folks to, I'm still being able to contribute some of my work. And one of the things that in this monthly comic strip that they asked me, like, do you want to pitch something? And I was like, well, right now I'm in like I'm entering my 40s and I'm living a whole different life. One of them, a huge change was that my sister had to go on dialysis, and my mother and I have become her caretakers, right? And so very not the idea of how I thought I was going to enter my 30s, but this is my life, right? And so one of the things that I was feeling very alone in this, like in terms of like, I'm not living my gay life. This how I whatever I that was in my mind, right? And I mean, dating has been very interesting, but I I wanted to put it out into the world through this comic strip and just talking about, what it's like to cohabitate with your family again after like almost over a decade of not living with them. And the immediate connection, the responses that I got from people reading the comic strip was just so touching for me, because it's like there's this idea that we have to be at a certain place in our lives by a certain age, or you're not seen as an adult, whatever. Again, this fake ideas of adulthood, right? But the reality is that a lot of us, and especially the queer children, the women in the family, are the ones that have to come and do the caretaking, right? Um, and so it's been very freeing to me to be able to write about my life and just put it out into the world, because I feel less alone, and really changing the ways that people view adulthood, right? Like I think it's important to document that and to share it and feel less alone. Listen, I do art because I, it's my way of connecting with people, but also somebody telling me, Julio, I felt seen, or the story that you wrote, or the image that you made, it connected with me because I'm dealing with A, B, and C, right? I'm like, I'm less alone. So it really, a lot of my art, it's about processing what I'm dealing with and putting it out into the world. And I'm just thankful that people are open to receiving it. And this actually, where I'm for the next installment, which is for the April installment, I'm gonna talk about being sober, and I'm gonna talk about and that was because my my therapist was like, I just didn't know how to talk about that in a way that just I don't want to add another layer to my identities, like queer, undocumented, like, so, like, but one of the things that he was telling me, he's like, this is your way of dealing of putting, like, why are you stopping yourself from doing that? You put yourself so much of yourself out there, might as well put something out there that others might feel connected with, right? And so I'm doing that for the next installment. So stay tuned. I put it on my Instagram every month.
Great. Thank you so much for such wonderful conversation. Just hearing you speak makes me reflect of my own kind of trinchera, my own little place of, for better or worse, I decided to go into academia, and that's that monster. It's a totally, that should be a whole other conference on its own. But I usually, borrow this phrase from a colleague from UC Berkeley, who said that they hold an open relationship with academia, and that's pretty much my my way of dealing with it, because I find enjoyment at the bar and at night, and being out at night, disrupts the cycles of neoliberal and capitalist production, because I'm out partying, getting wasted or not, or just getting high, getting lost into the night, losing a heel here and there, just leaving lipstick marks onto people's bodies or anywhere. As I'm going up for tenure next year, and that is such a very frightening experience because of all the bureaucracy behind it. And also, I mean, truth be told, and everybody here knows it, the place that I'm in, it's not ideal. And I think that just being able to sit in that discomfort makes me just appreciate what I have, and also just let go of those expectations that for some reason one puts into, one's head, or I did, I just said, I don't feel like I'm at home here. I need to be somewhere closer to the West Coast or to the border. And as I feel that illusion, a dream just drifts away, it's also a time for me to repoliticize and really reframe myself in the context of what I do. And my activism is not just out in stage, disrupting the little white kids, forcing them to grapple with Lucia Mendez or something like that, but also to disrupt the white spaces of academia. And I deal with a lot of, less now, but a lot of international students from Latin America who don't really understand the race dynamics in the United States, and that come with this privilege as white passing, academics that come from a lettered elite. So confronting them with what is it that we are here in this context, and how we have to disassemble and assemble again, is something that I have made kind of like my own. It's where I continue this work of educating through decolonization, and to really question how is it that our own gaze, and not just our own gaze, but our desires, even as queer desires, are so intersected by whiteness, and what is it that we sometimes crave for and want is also tinted with that ideology of death. So that is, you'll find me hopping around the Pittsburgh nightlife scene. But during the day, I will be confronting and making noise in predominantly white institutions to bring accountability, but also to engage in the work that we all do in a way of decolonizing our own desires. So with that, I'm out of questions officially, but I wanted just to maybe open it up to the audience, or continue the conversation among us. I don't know if there are questions from the audience. This is the time for you to slay audience members and throw some shade at us if you want, or we can just, spark together in the exuberance of the queer joy, the queer brown joy that surrounds us, even if virtually.
while folks ask questions, Carlos, I really want to go see the play. Like, I think the work that Gloria is doing on TV, like, so it's just fabulous because it's her, it's Tania Saracho, who from like Chicago. You know, it's hard out here. And one of the programs that we started at the Center for Cultural Power is it's really inspired by the work that they're doing, creating Latina, writers' rooms. It's very unheard of, right? And so I think one of the things I always like to kind of leave it on, and Carlos, maybe we can talk about fundraising afterwards, but it's very hard to fundraise programs like that. You will be, I mean, I'm sure none of us are here is surprised. Our program is really a space for folks to come and workshop. It's just like investing in them in early career spaces, because it's just so hard to find those things. While I love doing the work that I do, I cannot pay my rent with a poster. And so, having that, I mean, here in LA, I know everybody wants to write their own, everybody's working on a script, but being able to create a program that, invests on BIPOC writers, not just Latina, but like Black, Asian, like, folks across those groups, it's something very important. And it's just, I struggle every year because we're entering our 5th year, and I'm like, are we gonna be able to get funds for this? Are we gonna be able to get that? And so I'm happy when shows like that open and people come and see them, because that's another extra thing that we need to support each other's work once it
Yeah.
gets made.
I think it's also a good example of like other, like particularly, Pasadena being such an older institution, being like, hey, like this older institution, they're doing it. How come we can't do it? Because oftentimes people are saying there's not data. Like,
Yeah.
we don't know if this is going to succeed. And it's the risk adverse funders who don't want to promote or give money to this. And nowadays we can be like, no, but these institutions are doing it. So like I think of like the Met Opera finally doing Florencia en las Amazonas by Daniel Catan. I think of basically all of Chicago Latino Theater Alliance, CLATA, throwing a whole damn festival of Latina playwrights and Latina actors. I think of our Chicago Shakespeare did a Shakespeare production of Measure for Measure set in Cuba. And then I think about it, just like, how come the messaging of Shakespeare, which is really over like hundreds of years ago, is still relevant today? I think it's funny. I think it's wild, and I think it's brilliant when we can change those stories. But yeah, I have to provide at least context. Like the reason why I really classify myself as an anti-capitalist fundraiser is that I really am tired of convincing folks that arts matters. And like fundraisers on a yearly basis have to be like, hey, can you give us money? And I'm just like, how do you not know we're important? Like we do this every year.
Yeah.
I like take you to a show. You're like, oh, this is fun. I'm just like, yes, it's important, and we need you to survive, as opposed to like, hey, like, how would you put an iPhone alarm on your phone, and like next year you like, oh, just give us the money, and that way we can like handle everything else later. That to me, like, I'm just like, why are we making rich people feel good about the fact that they made a system that doesn't benefit the art?
I have so many thoughts about that when they feel so proud. But like,
I mean, I think of Edgar Villanueva decolonizing the world, where he was just like, like philanthropy is talked about the love of humanity, and I question whose humanity were we loving in philanthropy. And then he talks about, a lot of the folks who believe in giving is because of altruistic reasons, and he argues just like it's not altruistic, it's just white savior complex.
yeah.
So, fun times in the fundraising world. Whoa.
So there is a question from the audience from Oscar Zapata. Oscar, I don't know if you're there. Would you mind to like unmute yourself and and pose the question?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry, I'm still working. Thank you so much for your interventions and like your testimonies. I really appreciate and enjoy this panel. So my question is just like, can you talk a little bit more about your work and this idea of like queer joy in the context of the incoming presidential elections? Because I feel like I remember being at the border in 2014 during the elections, the first kind of like Trump administration. I was like just like feeling the vibes, and I felt like that those times were really stressful for many like members of like the community. And yeah, I just want to hear your thoughts about that, and if you have like some plans or some incoming projects trying to tackle those difficult times ahead of us.
Ay, pues I live in Puerto Rico, so we can't vote for president because we're a colony. So yeah, that's the entry point. I've actually never voted for president because when I was in Philadelphia, like when the election came up, it's whatever the timing or whatever. But the first time it was because I had took a very strong stance where I was like sort of refused to participate in US electoral politics because I was like, yeah, I'm a colonized person. So at the end of the day, it's so hard for me because of what's happening with Palestine, because it's like we see it from here as like it could be us, right? It could very easily be us. And I don't think that's unique to Puerto Rico as an experience. Certainly, many oppressed peoples have felt that way, but it's so bound up at this point with the Democratic Party. It's so heartbreaking because it's like, bueno, si va a ser fatal bajo Trump. There's no like, it feels like kind of an impasse. And at least, it definitely feels like the silencing in institutions in the US is very strong. I have a lot of empathy for how people are navigating things, certainly. But at least for me, it's an impossible question to even answer or engage with because of that. And also as a trans person, because here, much like all over the world, there's a rise in a very, very right, very right wing. And there's a political party, Proyecto de Dignidad, whose two main points of attack are, women's and people who need its reproductive rights and trans people, right? So there's a very strong campaign against educación con perspectiva de género, very open campaign against it, a vilification of trans people, and it's a very small community that doesn't have the support, so it's even more terrifying. There's been a rise in all the feminist sides plus all the like feminist sides of trans women plus all the just like hate crimes. So it's like, how do I grapple with kind of this impossible choice that isn't even really a choice because I can't vote. It ends up feeling like, yeah, the only thing I can see in a future where, at least for Puerto Rico, where people feel seen and free is decolonial. I just don't imagine it differently. And one that doesn't have capitalism, I just don't imagine it working another way. But I do understand like and have a lot of empathy for the way that people navigate, just trying to make things slightly better, for from any perspective, right? Whether that's through voting or however, or organizing, for the people they care for and love in this world. So I do understand I think I understand where the question comes from, but again, very limited by the fact that our electoral or like our political system is totally different. We're living under a junta that was put in place by the Democrats, an undemocratically elected junta. So it's all like, it feels distant in a sense, even though it's right next door and impacts our lives on the daily. Pero gracias por la pregunta.
No, heavy question for sure. I have to think of like, I have to think that all art is sociopolitical. I firmly believe that, even if it's not engaging in sociopolitics. And I think I'm not an artistic director nor nothing, but like when programming a season, like how can you not be political in today's climate when all art previously has been. And for me, it's a little easier to say that now because I'm like Shakespeare was so political. Like he fully wrote plays about the royals because he was paid to, one and foremost, but also like he was kind of shady in it too. Like so when people tell me, "Oh, this is too political, why is it on stage?" I'm just like, because it deserves to be, because it always has. And just because it doesn't fit your comfortability doesn't mean it doesn't belong on stage. But you're so right. Finding queer joy is really an essence of battling all of this. So for me, it is one, combating that, living my best self even amongst it, knowing that if I were to march tomorrow for the sake of humanity that I believe in, and if I died and put my body in the White House because it is their fault that I am dead, very much in kin to like the AIDS epidemic and the way people fought back then and are still fighting to this day. And also making out with a cute boy at a club and not knowing their name and then like going home at 1:30 a.m. That like those are things I'm living for. And that's how I'm just like, right, this country is a mess and both sides are awful. And one side is obviously, like occasionally fighting for queer folks and Latinas, but not at the extent of outside of their profits. So
Thank y'all for that. So one of the other hats that I wear, I'm part of this I hate party calling it a party crew so 90s, but it is essentially a party crew. But we actually this party crew is called Cumbiaton, and we started it well I wasn't part right at the beginning, but it was started by DJ Sizzle. Shout out if you don't know who DJ Sizzle is, look her up. She's an amazing DJ based out of East LA, Boyle Heights area. And that party was started right after 45 was elected in 2016. And the whole point of that was they literally got together at this little bar in Boyle Heights, and they just threw music, a couple of uh activists. DJ Sissel comes from a background of activism and labor and immigration, and she's like, let's just party, let's celebrate ourselves, let's be together, let's cry together, and let's dance. And so we're fast forward to this year, and we are continuing putting together this event now at a bigger scale. We've gone to Seattle. We were actually talking about going to Texas, but then somebody in our team was like, as before, like that's just happened. Like, what's gonna happen? I was like, it is because of things like that that community needs this spaces, and we're gonna bring the party. So we're actually trying to go to Chicago too. So let's connect about that. And so I think that's one of the things. I am not a DJ. I've been told very clearly. But I create the flyers. I create the to promote the party. So to me, making even something like that, like it's like I'm not thinking about that. Also, I'm undocumented, so I cannot vote, but we know how to put together a beautiful event, and we've just done it all around the country. And we're very blessed to be able to do this. And so more of that, more gatherings of just, a perrear,
It's such a charged question, Oscar. It gives me the chills because it brings me back to, a collective cry out when the Orange Menace was elected into the White House. And it just makes me think of many things. And one of them is that, neoliberal capitalism has really done it's worked very well of being dressed up as a sheep, but it's a gray wolf inside, because it has turned certain factions and certain sectors into being complacent with the current status quo. And I was at a panel the other day at Pitt, not surprisingly, full of white people talking about, transness. And I was just being really raw. And I was saying that, that film, it was a film discussion by the famous trans theorist, Paul Preciado, whose Testa Junkie is like seminal for trans studies. And I do have my qualms with that text. And I was just saying, sometimes Paul, they're kind of like a lover that just fucks you raw and leaves you kind of like, wiping your ass off with whatever you have so that you don't pick something. And the feminists, so feminists in the room, looked at me and gave me the eye. And I was just like, I'm sorry if I'm being crass with this, but I'm not going to abstract it, because the previous person that responded to the question was saying like, well, yeah, but my trans friend needs to get an ID. And I was just thinking, not being able to have an ID is it's not just a trans issue. It's an issue for immigration reform in this country. It's an issue for access to food security, to housing. And it's also an issue about how the United States is just perpetuating its logics of empire, the occupation of Palestine, the occupation of Puerto Rico, the occupation in the Middle East, in Africa. So I go back to, at least in the context of the United States, the queer movement with Marsha P. Johnson and, Sylvia Rivera, who were beyond, they were ahead of the game when it came to intersectionality. And intersectionality was not just an abstract word to describe multiple oppressions, but it was actually a lived experience that, we are queer, we're trans, we're poor, we're migrants. So if we cannot understand a queer politics that is that expansive, and that, sexual liberation cannot happen if we don't have a ceasefire, or if we don't decolonize the curriculum in universities, if we don't advocate for immigration reform, if we don't advocate for equal housing opportunities, for free access to education, none of this really matters. And as Roque was saying, we are seeing globally this kind of just reemergence and consolidation of fascism. And we see that in this country with reproductive rights being taken away, with LGBT reaffirming affirming care being gutted, DEI initiatives being stripped. So just in a very similar way that, a trans white person can have the privilege of getting an ID, just like that simple gesture of confirming or assuring, or however we want to phrase it, of reaffirming trans citizenship can be taken away. So I just hope that we organize, we go underground if needed, and we make some loud fucking noise, because them bitches are coming after us. And white liberals are going to be complacent, and they're not going to do anything, because their whiteness and their privilege is going to remain untouched. So it is up to us to really see how is it that we're going to rock this ship, or we're going to hell sunk it to the ground. So on that beautiful note, is there any other questions?
I was gonna follow up on your Preciado, because I think it's been a minute since I got to hear someone respond to Preciado like that. I have a confession. I read Testo Junkie. I was maybe 17 years old, and I read it in my West Puerto Rico as an undergrad. And I did like it. I knew all the problems with it. You know, I had a very disidentificatory relationship with it. We put on a whole performance that was very based on reggaeton, and it was very different. And it was very not, Preciado's text. But I also think of that text as like a transition book. Like it's basically Preciado being like, I'm experimenting with testosterone. I'm not really trans, haha. And then it's like a year later, it's like Paul B. Preciado. So I don't, I take it as the messiness of a transition personally, right? But also yes, it's a European person, it's someone who's in love with French theory, it's a theorist. And that's probably why I have a identificatory relationship, right? Because there's so much freedom there that I don't have an access to on the daily. So it's almost like getting to watch someone play with free time that I don't necessarily have, and sort of enjoying that, as an imagined space. But, I did cry a little bit when everybody got their IDs at the end of the movie, even if it was like a French judge, who was Preciado's ex-girlfriend. I still was like, one day I really want us all to get those IDs, and like just have it in a ceremony that's as caring and not how it actually happens, which is not caring at all and very violent and the result of like organization and struggle and resistance, right? But I think that, yeah, in addition to what I echo everything you're saying, and I also think that we have been and will continue to build spaces that are very different from that imagined scene at the end of that film, but are also in a way like ensayo de la utopía, no? Like rehearsals for utopia, even if they're very small. And that's as central as the fighting back. And especially now that we're going to have less of them, because we're going to have to survive even more and fight even more for survival. Like in the way we treat each other, I think we can create those spaces, in the way we care for each other, in the way we're attentive to our differences. I would like to think that's what's going to help us survive what's coming. But that's me.
I know we're close to out of time, but I wanted to share recently, very relevant to everything we're sharing. I finally got my a new US passport with my gender labeled as X. I was thrilled and overjoyed, like really gender euphoria. And then as I traveled to Mexico, both in the US and returning to the US, the machines, because you can like check in just through a machine. They were like, you have to talk to an agent. Your gender's invalid. And I was just like, this is so funny. My gender goes beyond machine, beyond code. It felt so validating to be called by a machine that my gender's invalid, because I was just like, yeah, my gender is whatever I want it to be. How can it be valid by a machine? I just wanted to share that funny note that like like gender nonconforming trans folks are breaking down systems that have been in place. And my example of having an X in my passport is a good example of that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Roque, Julio, and Carlos. It's been a pleasure to have you here, and talking to you was really, it was really queer bliss. So thank you so much for your time, for your engagement, for your candidness. And just to say that, Roque, that I didn't hate the film. I think I was just responding to the whiteness of the room, and I used the film as proxy and kind of like just directed that white metropolitan theory thing with Preciado, and I just made it.
But it's there in Preciado. It's not there in Preciado.
Yes. So I was just more like, I do hope that someday we can all, stand before a judge and be seen as equal, regardless of what we are, what we identify as, and where we come from. So with that, thank you so much. Sending you a lot of love, and I'll be connecting with you in the future. Thank you so much for your time, and I wish you all well. And thank you so much for our our wonderful audience. And you have a happy Friday.